Strašidla. Série o tom, kde končí pravda a začínají mýty.
Ahoj, já jsem Lucie.
Já jsem Anna.
A jelikož k těm tarotům se podařilo Aničce něco úplně neskutečného, tedy získat rozhovor s profesorkou z Yaleu, tak jsme se rozhodli, že to se nestává jen tak každý den
A také proto, že se v překladu občas ledasco ztratí, tak si můžete poslechnout celý rozhovor v anglickém originále s profesorkou Todne Thomasovou právě teď v bonusovém díle Strašidel na Můj rozhlas. Užívejte.
Hello.
Hello, is this Professor Thomas?
Yes, it is.
Magic!
Is this Anna?
It is indeed. It's so great to hear you. I'm sorry, we've been having some small technical difficulties, but it's lovely to hear your voice.
No problem. That just goes with the job, right?
Oh, it certainly does, with both of our jobs, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I guess we can get started, but before we do, I'll tell you a little bit about the podcast that we're making, just so kind of you're aware. It's in Czech, it's called Strašidla, which it means spooks or monsters or just in general paranormal phenomenon, and it's a podcast that deals with these topics with sort of an ethnographic, sociographic perspective. And I'm making it with my colleague, Lucie. She's a historian. She does absolutely fantastic work in political and historical discourse around the 20th century. And she's an absolute gem. And we did want to make a few special episodes for our listeners before we get started on the second season of our podcast, which will be coming out at the end of the year. And we wanted to cover some sort of even more niche topics than the ones that we deal with within, the bounds of the podcast episodes themselves. And tarot is incredibly popular in the Czech Republic with all different kinds of people, ones that you might not even consider to be tarot enthusiasts.
It makes me want to come. I'm so curious about that. That's so incredible.
It really is. And we have another guest that is from the Czech Faculty of Religious Studies, and hopefully he will be able to tell us a little bit more about why this sort of sudden comeuppance of the phenomenon is present in the sort of Eurocentric context. But I'm really curious about contexts in other parts of the world, because obviously we don't want to be too confined to our sort of line of discourse. So I did approach you because I think that you're a wonderful fit for the podcast. I watched a few of your lectures online, and I think you're just an incredible speaker, first of all, which is obviously important in the context of a podcast. But you offer some incredible perspectives, so I'm excited to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for writing that overview. And I'm also really excited to think about just think with you and be in conversation with you about a kind of new project I'm undertaking. And I also this summer I start my sabbatical, and so I'm hoping to get to Europe as well.
Oh, nice.
Some research just to kind of look at some of the key historical sites and of tarot, and also to find some really interesting practice sites as well. So, knowing that tarot is big in the Czech Republic is really interesting to me, because I was thinking a lot about France or Mexico City and Cuba, where I have been doing some preliminary work already. So, that might be worth seeing for myself.
Oh, fantastic.
I appreciate that information.
If you do make your way to Prague, do let me know. I'd be absolutely happy to have you here at the radio, show you around. We don't have much tarot here in the building, I'm afraid, but, there's other interesting things I think I could show you. Magic. So I guess we can get started whenever you're ready.
I'm ready.
Magic. Fantastic. So, again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. We have another speaker that has covered the sort of Eurocentric context of tarot, but I'm curious, what about tarot in other parts of the world?
Yes, well, I mean, we can understand a bit of the Eurocentric perspective on tarot because tarot has such deep roots in Europe, right, in terms of its emergence and sort of Renaissance Italy as a game of strategy and chance, and until sort of like 18th century France, where people start sort of advocating for tarot to be used for divinatory purposes. But yes, tarot isn't confined by the European context in any case. As someone from the United States, as African American, my sort of first sort of origin story of tarot didn't involve Europe at all. It really focused on a place like New Orleans. right, which is already a place in the U.S. South which is surrounded by its own lore, some of which is based in historical realities around migration of people from the island of Haiti in the Caribbean to New Orleans in the midst of the Haitian Revolution, to, the instantiation of sort of French culture, and with French culture, French occultist culture as well, which would have been brought to Louisiana as well by migrants, which would include tarot as well as practices of spiritualism, which had become all the rage in modern Europe, but was also sort of very popular within French cultural settings as well. And so, when I think about tarot, the first image that comes to my mind, or the image that I grew up with, was the idea of, a black or brown woman who's dressed in sort of exotic fabric or opulent fabric, with a sort of turban, who has tarot cards, and she has almost an aura of beauty and danger, who can tell you your future, right? And she may or may have other gifts. She might have a crystal ball or tools, or she might be psychic, but tarot was the domain of such a person. One of the things that I think is really exciting about tarot, beyond sort of the archetypes we have in our own minds, like the images, the icons we have in our own minds, which are historical and imaginative constructions, has been the proliferation of tarot decks, right, with different kinds of images and reinterpretations. One of my favorite tarot decks is a hoodoo tarot deck, which really text and focuses on hoodoo culture, which is a kind of a spiritual assemblage practiced in the U.S. South from times of enslavement to the contemporary moment. There's a really beautiful voodoo tarot deck that shows imagery from the practice of Haitian voodoo, in which certain figures get sort of readapted into voodoo cosmology. So the high priestess becomes a voodoo priestess or a voodoo mambo. And so you see the ways in which sort of lexicons are bent or twisted or turned to be made sense of non-Western religious cosmologies as well, which I find to be fascinating. Another important, I think, aside from the Eurocentric context of tarot, is thinking about how tarot cards are read, right? There's an amazing book that I taught recently in my class on tarot called The Witch Studies Reader, which our audience might be interested in. It came out with Duke University Press in 2025. And one of the articles in the book talks about how tarot readings are used in different kinds of contexts, right? So rather than just a sort of patron-client context where someone pays or elicits support from someone who is conversant with tarot, we have context of tarot readings happening during protest movements, right? We have collective context where tarot is being read to think through, okay, we're trying to build a new world through our activism, okay? What are the elements? What are the cornerstones of this new world that we're trying to build, right? So tarot is being used not as a tool for kind of individual divination, but it's being used as a tool for a collective visioning of the future, right, which I find to be incredibly fascinating. I also say that one of the things that I have found, and this is a notably newer research trajectory for me, is the enduring appeal of tarot to artists and artistic audiences. Last summer, I was in Cuba, Havana, Cuba, and I was walking around Havana Vieja, Old Havana, and I went into a museum in Old Havana that foregrounded sort of Mexican culture representations, Mexican and Cuban political relations. And the sort of first exhibit room that you encounter when you walk into the museum, there is an exhibit by a local Cuban artist whose name eludes me now, but the artist had paintings of orishas, which are sort of divinities from Afro-Cuban religion, and interspersed in those images of those orisha or divinities were images from tarot cards, right, that were readapted to sort of the iconography almost looks like Egyptian or Ethiopian, right, in terms of the way the author was presenting faces, face shapes, large eyes, or almost kind of reminded of like sort of Near East Christianity in the shape of icons, Christian religious icons as well. And so you see these readaptations of the Two of Cups, right? And it took me about 3 or 4 minutes to realize, I'm like, these are tarot paintings, right? So I'm thinking of coming to an exhibit about Afro-Cuban religion, and that is very much present. But in between these paintings of these orisha, this like kind of religious canon, were images that spoke to tarot. And I was just floored by that, right? And I thought, okay, aside from, at some point wanting to interview this artist, what does it mean to place the iconic images of tarot next to the iconic images of divinities in, an enduring historical tradition, right? Is that a statement about the place of tarot as a juxtaposed tradition? Was it just a kind of casual decision that was made that was not designed to make a kind of broader statement? Did the iconography of one influence an attention to or desire to represent the iconography of the other, right? This is between sort of religion proper and a kind of spiritual practice. The other thing that's interesting about Havana as a space is if you go to Old Havana, especially in courtyards, there's a really huge Catholic church in Old Havana, and regularly you will see small tables set up, and there will be tarot readers there that are, trying to identify who the gringos tourists are to conduct tarot readings, right? And so to have tarot reading as a tourist practice be located in such spaces, assumedly, legally, next to a church, is also another kind of juxtaposition, right? That you have these sort of institutionalized religious landscapes, and you have tarot practice, tarot economy being right there next to that institutionalized religious presence, right? And if you're talking about churches in Old Havana, these churches are, hundreds of years old. So, I think that taking a few steps back, using another lens to think about tarot in ways that aren't Eurocentric is an invitation to think about the ways in which tarot imagery and iconography gets reinterpreted into non-Western religious traditions, a way in which tarot readings can take on new life and new forms than sort of, the 3-card draw or the Celtic cross, and then also thinking about sort of global adaptations of tarot and tarot imagery in terms of local artscapes as well, which can also give tarot, it's different than a card, it gives tarot a different kind of site for contemplation and visualization as well. So I hope I answered that question.
Plenty. You've absolutely answered it plenty. And there's a bunch of different points that I absolutely want to hit, but I want to stop towards the end first. You spoke about having sort of a juxtaposition of to some extent, almost a pagan religious practice in terms of fortune-telling, divination, clairvoyance, right next to a very traditional institution of a Catholic church or Christian church, I should say. So where do you suppose is the appeal that one might, get their fortune told and then go and pray inside a church? Where is the appeal of these more maybe hands-on practices?
Yeah, I don't know because I didn't ask because I didn't have my IRB yet. So I would hope I would get a chance to. But I think, one thing I did notice is that both the Catholic Church and the tarot tables were included in what I would call a kind of a tourist net, right? So a lot of sort of tourists go to churches as patrons, right? To go into churches to pray. To experience them not only religiously as Catholics, but culturally, to experience churches culturally, perhaps as non-Catholic or non-practicing persons, right? So it felt like the tarot readers would know that tourists would come to the church, and therefore they would then have access to those tourists either before or after entry. And so I was impressed by their savvy. Because I went into the church, as a religious studies professor, I always love to visit churches wherever I go. I went into the church as a tourist, and I, encountered, these like kind of professional, tarot readers outside of the church. So I think there's that, and I think it's like, and I would see occasionally because my Airbnb was in the neighborhood near that church. I would see people getting their fortunes read, at different points by tarot readers. One thing that I, would imagine on the part of the women who decide to conduct their business there is that they would assume that their clients would not see going into a church and having their cards read as a contradiction in terms, if that makes sense, right? Without having directly interviewed someone, that somehow some aspect of human experience was tended to by one, and some other aspect of human experience was tended to by the other, right?
Oh, that's a fantastic. That's a title right there. I can already see it. That's a really wonderful thought. I haven't thought of it that way. But I do want to go back to the sort of very vivid image that you painted of the woman with the sort of headdress, and her being the person that you would encounter if you were to have your fortune told. Because I think that to some extent for the sort of casual dabbler in clairvoyance or whatnot, it would seem that tarot is extremely accessible, and pretty much anyone with an access to internet can read their fortune with more or less accuracy. So I do want to inquire about maybe in this particular sort of aspect of tarot and hoodoo and that sort of part of the world, is it more customary to have sort of a shaman or an elder or a chosen person with the ability to divine things be the one to read your fortune, as opposed to, I don't know, every household having a deck and them sitting around the table and doing their readings? Is it for the chosen, this sort of clairvoyance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, well, one, this is a question that's difficult to answer because I think tarot is becoming it's just extremely popular. I became interested in tarot just as like a hobby when I was actually in Vermont, which is a very neo-pagan, Wiccan site, right? So I never really had sort of direct exposure to tarot cards as like something to own or something to have until I really went to Vermont. And I think one of the things we're seeing is the proliferation of types of there's cat tarot. There's a deck that has tarot for kids, tarot for children. There's tarot that focuses on trans experiences. There's tarot. There are decks that blend tarot and astrology. There's the market. The capitalist market, having gotten a hold of tarot, has made tarot increasingly desirable and accessible by everyday people as something to read. And having just taught a class on tarot, it was amazing how about half of the class were people who were very, very kind of heavily invested in tarot practice as like a regular form of practice in their everyday life. And there was about half of the class that had no prior experience with tarot really at all. And so, not to extend that as out as a way of this is what American society consists of or U.S. society consists of. But I would wonder if there's a way of thinking about the broader applicability of that. And the way that I was raised, tarot was something, the South, a certain kind of brand of Christianity that I was socialized into. Tarot was understood to be something dangerous, right? I remember the kind of pejorative vernacular term we used for tarot was the devil cards. And my mom still won't let me read tarot for her. And so there are still some very strong, resistances to that. At the same time, right, it was understood, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's from Virginia, Appalachian side of Virginia. I was talking to her mom, and she talked about, there was this stigma, but we also, even in the country, we had people who read cards, and we knew they were really good at it, right? Because they had a reputation for also kind of knowing things, right? So they were specialists, right? And whether you believed in it or not, she's like, sometimes you would see people who were super, super church going, and you go get your cards read, and you see them come out of her house. So I think I come from a cultural context where, the best tarot reading would be from a specialist, would be from someone who had supposedly a gift of sight, who maybe had co-occurring other types of spiritual gifts, who may have come from a family or a lineage of people who were understood to be, have their own sort of tele gifts, that we think a lot in sort of parapsychological terms. That tarot was the realm of the specialist. I think now, in this contemporary moment, I think tarot is becoming increasingly more mundane, and people are taking up the use of tarot as a kind of daily practice. There are tarot journals where you pull cards and you note them and you keep track of them, and so, I don't think that one is disappearing in favor of the other, but I definitely think that there is a kind of like everyday non-specialist realm of practice that seems to be very operable amongst people of a certain age, right? Young people, young adults, younger adults than me, I'm 43, here in the United States, if that hopefully answers your question.
It really does, and it makes me wonder about maybe a broader religious context, because you've mentioned that since there's so many different types of decks and so many different types of approaches and so many different ways to approach the practice itself, is it possible that this sort of highly personalized spiritual practice is, for the young people, a lot more attractive than something that is fairly generalized, like you would go to a traditional sermon? Is maybe the personalization part of the appeal?
I think so, right? I mean, if we look at sort of some of the sort of poll data on young people in the United States right now, Gen Z is sort of framed by, for instance, the Pew Center for Research as the kind of spiritual but not religious generation, and we also have a kind of generation of religious nuns. N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, which would also be super cool. A proliferation of religious nuns would be super cool in a time like this. Where people are kind of not claiming a kind of focal tradition as a cornerstone of their identity, or people are identifying as, well, I identify more as a spiritual person and not religious, right? And so, as a divinity school professor, I know that has precipitated thought about what does this mean about how people perceive, invest or disinvest in institutionalized forms of religious life. What does this mean in terms of how people understand when and where religious or practices of the sacred can take place? I think if we have the benefit of broader historical insight, we're less prone to panic around these things, in the sense that, in the 19th century France, 18th century France, right? This is revolutionary France. You have a populace that is critical of a kind of institution of the crown, right? And alongside that, critical of the hierarchy and institutionalized knowledge of the church, and the fact that only specialists could access and teach that knowledge, disseminate that knowledge. And so tarot becomes highly taken up by the French in such a moment, because it's an interpretive moment. It's a moment of questioning. It's a moment of critique. It's a moment of a certain set of rejections, right? And so, not to equate that moment to this moment, but there's certain cultural and historical moments where ideas of interpretation and interpretive authority are taken up for broader deliberation, right? And a set of disputes and contentions, and people finding places where they can assert their interpretive authority, right? For some, it was reading the Bible for themselves, right? After the sort of, challenge that Martin Luther makes in the Protestant Reformation. For some, it was the idea like, okay, well, there's this card game for Italian nobles, but there's this hidden esoteric knowledge in it, and if we know enough, we can read it and use it as a tool to think about certain kinds of religious paths, like hidden knowledge, and to also find hidden knowledge about our future, right? And so I would frame a kind of contemporary U.S. cultural moment in similar terms, that there are things going on in our society, and I'm sure in about 20 years we'll have a better set of handles and terminology to explain it. But I think it's a moment of interpretive authority that, for instance, technology has initiated. Social media, which is a greatly democratized knowledge and knowledge access, along with the internet before social media. My students are TikTok devotees, right? So I've heard that TikTok is a place where people, learn. There's like dissemination of information and esoteric information on TikTok. I would say AI as well as a kind of challenge to sort of traditional forms of knowledge, specialization, and authority, even for me as an academic, right? People being like, well, I can, you might have read all these books, but I can find out what you know through AI, right? So there's certain kinds of challenges to sort of authoritarian forms of knowledge and knowledge holding and desires for the democratization of knowledge. And I think tarot is a democratic form, right? There are people who have certain giftedness and have reputations that they establish through the accuracy of their readings. But I think there are people who want to take the cards into their own hands, right? Especially some of these religious, spiritual but not religious, or religious nuns who are thinking about what interpretation, who are thinking about, new forms or new ways of configuring and thinking with text. Is tarot a type of text now, right? A type of textual, very accessible because it's so visual, but a type of textual knowledge. Is it something that's accessible because you could just read a guidebook and spend time with it and learn how it works, or learn by contacting, electronic sages on TikTok, right? And so I think that there's something about the democracy of the form that has made it appealing that's actually been central to its endurance for so long. I mean, we're talking about something that emerged in the 1400s, and we're in the 21st century. One thing I would challenge is, rather than thinking about tarot as a pagan practice, which, I don't like the term pagan because it centers Christian notions of difference, which are highly imperial and highly European, should we consider tarot a global religion, right? Or a global spiritual form, right? That has at least recognizable symbolism, that has some recognizable fields of practice. Scholars of globalization of religion have talked about, one of my favorite scholars who studies globalization of religion says that for a religion to globalize, his name is Thomas Sortis, it must have transposable messages, and it must have portable practices. Tarot's both, right? You can put them in a little velvet bag and literally take them everywhere you go, right? The practices are portable. Learning about the practices are portable. You can get a tarot reading in New Orleans. You can get it in, Cuba and Havana. You can get it in a tarot reading in a class at Yale, right? And the messages, are the messages transposable? Well, seeing this proliferation of tarot decks that sort of work on encoding local knowledge, local religious systems, local worldviews and cosmologies, it seems like some, even overturning some, right? We've seen certain messages that are overturned in certain decks. Like there's one deck called Daughters of the Moon, and it only has women in its imagery, right? It was designed to really eject any type of patriarchal, male-centered authoritarian figure out of the deck, right? So definitely the iconography, the archetypes of tarot, at least to me, and my new scholarly sight set on this, seems very transposable, right? So might we be provocative here and argue that tarot is, and for some time has been, a global religion, or at least a global spiritual form?
That, in my books, it
and
is. You've sold it. You've sold me on it.
How does that make us feel? And then how do our feelings, our responses about that reveal to us about where we think religion lives or should live? What religion looks like and what it ought to look like. Those oughts and shoulds that are about sort of institution. Our fears about the ways in which culture changes and the directions in which culture is changing, and who is being empowered by certain practices, and who might be disempowered by certain practices, right? So I pose that as a question because even the rejection would be a good conversation.
Why do you suppose someone would reject the idea of tarot being a global religion?
I mean, I think it could be about sort of what we have tended to consider religion to be, how we define it, those sort of cultural and intellectual notions of religion that focus on tradition, and a real religion is a tradition that has a kind of place, a recognizable place of origin. It has been practiced for a certain amount of time. It has a set of codified text and textual knowledge and textual specialists that merit it being a topic of sustained study and inquiry. And in that case, I think there's a kind of Christian hegemony that's present in defining religion, as well as a kind of imperial Western European and intellectual hegemony about what counts as religion, and which I'm, as a scholar, I'm implicated, because having traditions and meeting that need ritual specialists and that need intellectual specialists is what helps me pay the bills, right? And the idea that there could be a kind of religious form that is not necessarily, it does have a site of origin, which is, early modern Italy, amongst the elites, right, where it was used as a playing card game, right? We don't tend to think of religion as having a notion of play encoded into it, right, in some ways. That it's a kind of, material culture that has taken on a life that probably maybe wasn't predicted by the early diviners of tarot. That even its religious genealogy is extremely eclectic, right? By the time it makes its way to sort of the 1700s in France, you have Freemasons, you have esoterics, right? Esotericists, you have people who are interested in a sort of romantic reclamation of Egypt, right? So we're kind of doing really bad Egyptology, but still very obsessed with Egypt. You have Kabbalah. You have it is from its very early history extremely eclectic in terms of its religious iconography and religious reference points. So it explodes the kind of sorting work, organizational work that the religious tradition, the religious genealogy does for us, that lays things out in kind of a rational world religion package, if that makes sense. And then you have tarot, like at least in its history, as attending sets of practices, like it being sort of lumped in or placed next to practices like gambling, right? A kind of fear of divinatory powers and what can happen if people prey upon people by using a divinatory meaning, right? Is it a scam, right? And in that way, it is related to, and has been related to forms of, for instance, I learned here from a librarian here that tarot cards had different forms of taxation that were sometimes designed to sort of limit its spread a little bit. That it was also sort of legally surveilled in the same way that spiritualists were doing seances. There's a lot of language about sort of religious hoaxes and people being, I think that's the term I like the most, is like people behaving as religious charlatans. I love the word charlatan. It's so dramatic. You know, and that it was a kind of, partly because it wasn't institutionalized, that people could be taken advantage of. Now we know that, you know, churches also have charlatans and all, you know, but there's something about its form and the way that it exists kind of free and out in the open that has made it also, I think, an object of, and I think, you know, for some, in some instances for good reason, an object of scrutiny and concern, right? Because any tool, when it gets into the hands of charlatans or bad people or people who are prone to exploitation, any tool that gets to the hand of exploited people is bad. It's just that we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the same applies to Christianity.
That makes
right?
that makes perfect sense. I have my last question coming up. I don't want to keep you any longer, but it's an absolutely fascinating listen. In the Czech Republic, we have a few famous fairy tales and just poems and whatnot that warn people against trying to find out what their future holds for fear of different kinds of consequences. I'm curious, do the states have something like that as well? Is that a topic in your classes or anywhere else?
I don't know if it's a topic in my classes, but I know that there are, for instance, certain interpretations of the Bible that warn against, like, soothsaying, right? We know, for instance, in the Old Testament, the Witch of Endor is supposedly a really, you know, this is the Old Testament of the Bible, was a very sort of successful seer, for lack of a better word. And, you know, her practice was legalized because it was understood to come from consorting with spirits of the dead, right, which was understood to be necromancy, which was outlawed by Hebrew, law, right, like religious law. Like these were inappropriate practices. And yet, right, King Samuel goes to this woman to find out what will happen to him. Right? This is Samuel who's being confronted with the reality that this young person, David, has been prophesied within, Jewish religion, within the religious stakeholders of his day, to be his successor, right, or to potentially replace him. And so you see instances in which certain practices are outlawed by institutions, and still people still perpetuating and practicing those outlawed practices, and religious figureheads or political figureheads, really. So he's a king, so he's both in a sense, seeking out the very processes that they've outlawed to have access to divinatory knowledge. There are also places in the New Testament that talk about the coming of Christ, which is really supposed to be the future-oriented event that all real Christian believers are concerned with. Right? When will Christ come? And you know, the Bible, there's different ways of this. It says, no man knows the day or the hour. I will say that there have been more prophetic forms of Christianity that have made predictions. And when those predictions don't come true, they are destructive. There's this thing called the Great Disappointment, which happens. This is called the burnt-over district of upstate New York, because so many religious movements started there. And the Millerite movement, which eventually becomes the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, there was an actual time that was predicted for the coming of Christ, and when that didn't happen, it had huge effects on practitioners. People had sold their homes and whatever. It had huge material effects. It also had huge epistemic or knowledge-based effects as well. Like, who knows the future? Who can we trust? Should we try to know the future? Should we try to prepare for this future? What is the nature of imminence? Right? Is imminence something close that we can feel or see or touch, or is imminence just a horizon that kind of stays on the horizon, right? So I don't know if we have the same kind of codified tales. I mean, my mom personally thinks it's not good practice to poke. She calls it poking at the future because you never know what you'll find. But definitely, I think within certain more popular interpretations or North American engagements with prophecy, there have been some cautionary tales or key stories or key historical moments where forms of trying to forecast in religious terms have been thought to be dangerous, something that should be outlawed, or something that leads to great catastrophe because that form of knowing is so unreliable, right? So yeah.
That's it from me. I just have one more question. If you could clarify, please, in the very first question, you spoke about the divinities, the divine figures that you saw, and I could you spell them for me just so I can kind of look them up and look for a translation and whatnot?
Oh yeah, they're called Orisha. Mm-hmm. Orisha, and they would be like these divine figures within an Afro-Cuban religion that is referred to by outsiders more commonly as Santeria, Santera, or Regla de Ocho, which is the rule of 8. So Regla, which means rule in Spanish, Regla, Deocha.
Got it.
But it's also known in some of the religious studies literature as Lukumi, which is the Yoruba term, which is Lukumi. So those are three kind of differently situated terms that refer to the set of practices. So I walked in the museum and I was like, oh, these are Orisha, right, which I would expect in Cuba, right? Because, this is a Cuban religion, right, that blends Nigerian elements with Catholic elements, right? So it's a hybrid religion. It is Yoruba, it is Christian, it is both in some ways, right? And then you would see just around these like Obatala or Shango, which is they have a fascinating cosmology in their own right. Each of these divine beings. See tarot cards between these gods, for lack of a better word, and I was like, are these tarot cards? I mean, it really took me a second because I was so focused on the divine beings that I missed that this artist had made the choice to depict scenes from tarot, and not major arcana, minor arcana as well, like the Two of Cups or the eight of wands.
That must have been a fascinating catch.
It was. It was fascinating to see both of these images kind of, they weren't separated, one wasn't kind of like cast as like, they were very much integrated into the same exhibition hall. And so I was very much struck by that there wasn't the separation. And I would only say, one thing I would add is that part of the reason why perhaps a tarot reading outside of a church is not so crazy a notion is that there's so much imagery in tarot that's Christian.
True.
So much, right? At least in terms of, I grew up Christian, and like I only literally, towards the end of my tarot class, I was looking at the Tower card. I was like, is this referring to the Tower of Babel? And how have I not caught on to that, right? But things from like the Hierophants, right? The imagery, like I even think of I think it's the Three of Pentacles. They're standing outside of a church with a stained glass window, right? But there's so much Christian iconography and imagery I'm thinking of the Rider-Waite tarot deck, that's already incorporated or baked into tarot. So when we think about that, and some of that imagery, the stained glass window, I mean, the Catholic Church would have right there. So they're shared image-scapes at the very least, right? And that sometimes tends to be lost. I would really like to write and research more about the Christianity of tarot, because that history is super eclectic and it explodes some of our categories as scholars. So that's a great midlife project.
Absolutely.
But it's such an eclectic history. It's such an eclectic, weird, and I'm not a historian, so that might be why I want to actually do it, because I think as a historian, I probably wouldn't want to touch it. But it's like a yard sale. It's so clunky and strange, and like, my mom, is a preacher, and I remember when I found out that it was actually French Protestant ministers that said that people should use tarot for divination. I'm like, it was preachers who actually said the devil card should be used that way. And I took great delight, not to knock, preachers and all of that. I have deep respect. I mean, my students are in divinity school, but just our ideas about where things come from and the fact that sometimes history is so much messier than tradition, the neatness that our concept of tradition or genealogy or lineage does to religion or spirituality, right? That actually the history is messier than what a tradition focus might lead us to believe.
I would argue that the messiness is what makes it human and appealable to me. I
agree.
That's just that's where the beauty comes from.
Yeah. This idea that you have something that's literally endured all of these centuries. Some religious movements have come and gone, but tarot is still here, right? It says something. It says maybe more than one thing, and I'm curious about some of the things that it says. So,
fantastic! That was incredible. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
You are welcome. Thank you so much for reaching out and for setting up this opportunity, this thought experiment. I've very much enjoyed it.
I have as well, and when we're done with the cutting, as I've mentioned in the email, we'll have one version translated and kind of injected into the standard format, but we will also make sure that we are putting out the interview in its entirety in English if anyone wants to come, and just be part of the conversation, and will enjoy it in the original as well. So I just want to make sure that we have both of the versions available for our listeners to enjoy. So I'll be sure to send them over. They're not geo-blocked, so you'll be able to listen to them as well if you ever feel inclined to do so.
Yeah, and I'll also send them to our communications departments as well at the Divinity School and for the Religious Studies Department, and I'll be able to put them up on our website.
Oh, magic. That would be lovely.
So people can learn more about yours, so people can learn more about the work that y'all do on a regular basis, too.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. That would be incredible. Again, thank you so much for speaking with me, and I'll keep you updated on the progress. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Have a good one. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.